All right, listeners, I think you know that we are part of the Radiotopia network, which is basically a network built on the idea that you should support the most creative, independent audio makers around. No one, and I mean no one, embodies the Radiotopia ethos more than Benjamin Walker and his show Theory of Everything. Benjamin, who I've known for a long time, has been making beautiful, personal, sprawling audio documentaries for decades that help us understand the very strange world we live in. And now he has a new series called Not All Propaganda is Art. The new series goes back to the 1950s when Western security agencies like the CIA paid artists, writers, and intellectuals to fight the cultural Cold War.
The CIA funds were free. I mean, no one was told what to say.
Gloria Steinem, activist who sees the CIA as a sort of enlightened pal or rich uncle, there is another viewpoint.
Look, if you're listening to this show, I know you like secret histories. I know you like a mix of culture and politics and shadowy figures. So what are you waiting for? Not All Propaganda is Art from Benjamin Walker. You can find it now wherever you listen or at theoryofeverythingpodcast.com. This episode is brought to you by Progressive, where drivers who save by switching save nearly $750 on average. Quote now at progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates, national average 12-month savings of $744 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2022 and May 2023. Potential savings will vary. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, December 16th, 1862. We are, of course, in the middle of the Civil War as the Union Army is trying to capture parts of Mississippi and Tennessee. Union Major General Ulysses S. Grant issues an order, General Order Number 11. Well, what did General Order Number 11 do? Let me read from the proclamation I'm quoting here. The Jews, as a class, violating every regulation of trade established by the Treasury Department and also department orders, are hereby expelled from the department. In plainer language, the department is the military district that Grant is currently overseeing. So Grant is expelling Jews from this area, which covered parts of Tennessee, Mississippi, and Kentucky. So a fascinating moment, a Union general deep in the South issuing a proclamation targeting a class of people. Let's talk about it with, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Columbia and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hi, Jody.
Hey there.
So obviously Grant's motivations are the sort of big question here to figure out. But maybe let's start with just some of the specific stories. I mean, this proclamation gets issued. There are Jewish communities in a lot of towns throughout the South, and just some of the stories you hear about people basically having to pack up their lives and leave their towns. Obviously, already in the context of a civil war, it's heartbreaking.
It's reminiscent in many ways. An example that might be more familiar to our listeners, which is Japanese Americans and Japanese immigrants having to pack up all of their belongings and move to internment camps in the United States. It's that same kind of idea that there's a threat in this area and we have to remove everyone who resembles this threat in order to protect the country.
And, this is something that gets perpetuated in so many spaces over time. But I think that people think of more of Jewish expulsion within the United States within like maybe a 20th century context. But to think of it in terms of the Civil War is sort of like, oh, okay, this is different. And I think it's also interesting because, Grant, this is not the Confederacy, like which might seem a little bit more appropriate. This is Ulysses S. Grant, who's basically saying, hey, you guys have got to go.
With just a little more color, and then I want to talk about that, why Grant says that. But, in Holly Springs, Mississippi, Jews are rounded up by Union forces and forced to leave the city on foot. Paducah, Kentucky has 30 Jewish families who had been there for generations and generations. None of them really involved in the war. Actually, some of them are Union Army veterans. They're given 24 hours to leave. They send a sort of heartbreaking telegram to President Lincoln condemning it and asking for mercy. Generally, a lot of newspapers criticize this. There's almost a censure in Congress of this act. I think we can circle back to some of that ramification. But Grant's motivations for this order. How do we start to parse that?
Well, I think it's important to understand that Grant's trying to cut back on what he sees as like military corruption. He's trying to stop this illicit trade of Southern cotton. Cotton is still very much a big deal. So the South during the Civil War actually burns millions and millions of bales of cotton in order to create a shortage, in order to skyrocket the price of cotton. And so if you can sell or purchase or trade cotton sort of on these black markets underground, still making exchanges with the Confederacy, there are a lot of profits to be made. But one of the ways that the Union is trying to undermine the Confederacy is to prevent them from being able to sell their cash cow.
Yeah, that this was seen as vital to the war effort. And so Grant, who is trying to defeat the Confederate Army, sees this flow of goods as a way that is sustaining the very people he is fighting against. So if you are going to win this war against the Confederacy, you have to choke off their supplies. And this illicit trade in cotton is keeping them fueled up, right? Is prolonging the war. And so he sees almost an ethical obligation to stop this supply in any way possible. And this gets back to that idea of a kind of total war that we talked about in Sherman's March to the Sea, right? That it encompasses everything. So if you have to expel a group of people from a region in order to win this war, well, you expel that group of people and you deal with the consequences afterward.
But what's so problematic about it is it's like the oldest racist trope is to associate Jewish people with doing these illicit trades, and there's sort of this merchant class that's doing all these shady, business dealings. And so whether it's true or rumored doesn't really matter. It's the fact that you can pinpoint this group and then ostracize them and then create all kinds of harm based off of these racist ideas about what the Jewish people might be doing.
And it's the classic scapegoating of Jewish people, that they're connected to trade and to mercantilism and to money, and that they're disloyal. There are all of these tropes that have led to purges in Europe, that have led to purges in Russia, and that are now fueling this purge in the U.S.
Right. Yeah, there's certainly scapegoating here, but also I think, also stereotyping at some basic level, where it's not, I don't think that Grant was looking for an excuse to target Jews. He was, as we're saying, said, there's a lot of illicit trade going on. Well, who must be responsible? It must be the Jews. And so then he issues this proclamation, which is based on a stereotype and ends up scapegoating. And from what we can tell, there isn't a ton of evidence that it is Jewish merchants who are responsible for this. I mean, the economy of the South is complicated and diverse, and there was all sorts of illegal trade going on in the midst of the war.
And mercenaries, just hired hands, just people doing black markets. It's war.
Yeah.
And the Jewish people in the South make up such a small part of that population that they certainly weren't the only ones engaged in this kind of trade.
So, I don't know, there's a very blunt way to ask this question, probably more nuanced, but the blunt way is should we think of Grant as an anti-Semite? I mean, should we, how do we sort of put this into a sense of a Union general? Like you were saying, Kellie, if this had come from the South, we would have said, well, yeah, there's a deep history of racism and anti-Semitism in the South, and we understand that. What do we make of the fact that it's Grant, and what does it say about him?
I mean, I think it's certainly a stain on his legacy. It's certainly a moment in which we have to pause. But like Lincoln, Grant's complicated. Everyone has moments where they engage in, really poor practices and then also really progressive practices. And so Grant is also, I would say, someone who falls in that line. When he becomes president of the United States in 1868, he really tries to correct some of these stains by appointing a record number of Jewish Americans to government to office to give them positions of power. And so he is trying to give more separation of church and state, to give more protection to religious groups, not just Christians, but Jewish people as well. And so in some ways, Jewish people see his presidency as one that's very favorable toward them.
And there certainly is something anti-Semitic in the thinking that attaches the actions of a few Jewish people to all Jewish people and then leads to their expulsion. But Grant himself even comes out later in 1868 when he's trying to clean up his record here. And he writes in a letter, he says, "I do not pretend to sustain the order. The order was made and sent out without any reflection and without thinking of the Jews as a sect or a race to themselves, but simply as persons who had successfully violated an order." And then he underscores that by saying, "I have no prejudice against sect or race, but want each individual to be judged by his own merit. General Orders number 11 does not sustain this statement," right? It's not consistent with what I just said, but then I do not sustain that order. I no longer stand by it. And there is this sense that he understands what's wrong with General Order number 11 and is working hard to distance himself from it and to show that he is committed to that proposition that I have no prejudice against sect or race.
And I think there's a way to view that as a genuine apology and a recanting of something he'd done. I think there's a way to view it as he's now running for office, as you said. It's 5 years later, and he needs to sort of, shore up his constituencies. It's probably a combination of the two. But there was repudiation in real time as well. In 1863, when this is ordered, Abraham Lincoln countermands the order. There are, as we've been saying, newspapers, come out against it. So I think there was a recognition, even in real time, that this goes too far, and the way this was crafted was over the line.
I think that's a huge part of this story. That in the moment, people said, we're not doing that, is an important snapshot of both that it went too far and that there was a real resistance to this idea of saying all Jewish people are doing X, we must remove the Jewish people.
Does this tie into a sort of larger conversation we've had a number of times and a larger thing that I think about with the war, which is, there's just this larger swirling conversation about how much the war was about morality, how much the war was about economics. And certainly when we look at the South, we think about like economics trumping and slavery, trumping, ideas about states' rights or morality or whatever. But like this is almost a slight analog on the other side too, which is the North, Grant is thinking in economic, tactical terms here, and he lets prejudice sort of be subservient to that. And it's maybe a reminder that both sides of this war are fighting in many ways on more practical terms, not around high-minded ideals.
No, I think that's absolutely true. And when I say, it sounds, superficial to say it's complicated, but it is. Like people are making decisions in the moment. They're thinking about the war efforts. They're also thinking about their own conscience. I mean, this is what Lincoln gets so touted for, is his ability to sort of like change his mind and pivot, and then have the radical Republicans call him out and say, hey, no, Lincoln, you're wrong for this, and we're gonna go behind you and make different changes and different decisions. Like there's a lot, I think, that goes into getting the Confederacy to be broken and bringing them back into the Union. There's a lot that goes into addressing all of these different groups, from Jewish people to Native Americans to enslaved people.
Yeah, and the importance of not insisting on perfect heroes in these stories.
Yeah.
I think it is fair to say that the U.S. was on the right side of this war and the Confederacy was on the wrong side of this war, and slavery was bad and awful and evil, but that doesn't mean that everyone who fought on the U.S. side were perfect angels, nor that they prosecuted the war in a way that was completely clean-handed. So I think that bringing these complexities of Grant to the surface are really important for understanding who he was and how the war was fought.
Yeah. We did that with Sherman, too, with Sherman's March a couple episodes back, complicating him.
Yeah, for sure. Any thoughts here? You hinted at it a little bit, Kellie, but any thoughts here about sort of Grant and the Jewish community throughout the years? It seems to be this really interesting and ongoing relationship. He seems to have thought a lot about church and state and different, the rise of different religions. And
he attends in 1876 in Washington, D.C. He attends the opening of a new synagogue, and it's a 3-hour ceremony. And while he's there, he speaks out against Jewish persecution in other countries, and really tries to show his support and friendship to the Jewish community. So much so that when Grant dies in July of 1855, the Philadelphia Jewish Record basically said, none will mourn his loss more sincerely than the Hebrew, which I think goes a long way to showing how much he had repaired his relationships with the Jewish community. And that some people held him in high esteem.
And just to underscore Kellie's point about the separation of church and state, recall that at a moment when the U.S. was presumed to be a Protestant nation, that to underscore the separation of church and state was to protect Jewish people, was to protect their right to freely exercise their religion and also to operate in public and government life without having to face sanctions for being Jewish. And so today we talk about the separation of church and state, and it feels almost like a slogan, but it has a real meaning, particularly in this moment, particularly when so many countries in Europe as well were overtly Christian or Catholic, and that has a real meaning in this moment.
That's such a fascinating legacy and evolution. I mean, obviously he issues this order, 1863. I wonder if, 20 years later he gets that prized Gentile invite to the Seder. He gets to be the one who gets to go and is brought back into the fold. But yeah, who knows? I mean, it's really fascinating. All right, let's end it there. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thanks, Jody.
Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Support for This Day in Esoteric Political History comes from Odoo. What is Odoo? Well, Odoo is the only software your business will ever need. Featuring a suite of integrated business applications, Odoo connects your business operations together so you can get more done in less time. Odoo has apps for everything: CRM, accounting, sales, HR, inventory, marketing, manufacturing, you name it, Odoo's got it. To learn more, visit odoo.com/thisday. That's odoo.com/thisday.
Radiotopia. From